Welcome, everyone. It's great to see that our numbers are even a little bit stronger than our first Merit quarterly meeting. So this is exciting. Again, sort of our hope is to develop a quarterly meeting where people present, share ideas, and that there's robust discussion amongst all of us who are interested in these things. And we hope to, continue to encourage more and more people to attend, and hoping many of you will be willing to present in the future. So for today, it's going to be a talk on supervision. It's going to be led by friend and colleague Jay Hamm. Jay's a clinical psychologist at the Sandra Eskenazi Mental Health Center. And his discussant will be Jackie Hillis, also a psychotherapist, both Merit therapists. Jackie's in Chillicothe, Ohio at the VA. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to them. There'll be a presentation, and I hope we can have a discussion amongst ourselves. Again, thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. This will look right. I practiced this before everyone logged on, and then when I just went to share again, I had like 20 different new options. So,
looks good from here.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, happy to kind of talk through some of these things today. I'm looking around the tiles here. I'm feeling some acute source of stress that many of you have experienced supervision with me. So hopefully this will be consistent with your experiences, but I suppose we could save the final portion for everyone just kind of laying into how inconsistent my thoughts are here with your actual experience of sitting in the room with me. But the idea, I think, is to talk through some ideas about what supervision is like with Merit, and then have Jackie kind of offer some of her thoughts in response to this, but then really to try to open up and stimulate some kind of shared discussion and thinking. What I'm going to walk through today is an extension of some previous work. So over the last year or so, a few of us had put together a recent or a kind of new supervision paper that sort of built off of a couple of previous pieces, and then also just our own work in supervision. I guess for the couple of you that I don't know as well, I should say, I, as Paul said, I've been at Sandra Eskenazi Mental Health Center since 2013, and have been supervising doctoral and master's level students in Merit, as well as providing some supervision to some of the staff here in the clinic. And so I've been deeply interested in these ideas. I've been working with many of you in the room on some of these previous papers over the last several years. So I think in 2016, we wrote a paper that really focused on how some of the interpersonal stances emerge in supervision and how to respond to those. And then more recently, there was this paper in the American Journal of Psychoanalysis about a couple of challenges for supervision and Merit. The hope is that this new paper, which is currently under review at Psychological Services, kind of builds off of these things, and in particular looks at some of the special challenges in trying to offer this kind of supervision in public sector settings. At the root of it, though, I think is really, like, why is supervision important, and what do we think we're doing in Merit supervision? What are the kind of the key parts of it? I think all of us here are certainly in agreement about these basic claims on this slide, but supervision does seem to be essential to establish quality of care, is linked with positive clinical outcomes, professional development. But certainly my experience, and I think broadly across the public sector in America, high quality clinical supervision is increasingly scarce. There are lots of trends that privilege more kind of administrative tasks, as well as an approach to supervision that's really based on kind of concrete competencies and sort of checklist approach to ensuring that people are using evidence-based practices to fidelity or some such. It doesn't seem, though, that these movements towards administrative monitoring or competency-based supervisions fully attend to some of the complex needs of individuals experiencing psychosis, and certainly the complex challenges that arise in these settings where the majority of us are practicing. So what we've done in this new paper is to try to identify, like, what are the key kind of overarching tasks in merit supervision. I'll try to break down those a little bit. But what we came up with is that what we think these three kind of interrelated ideas. First is helping a supervisee recognize and reflect upon their experience of themselves, their patients, and then what's happening between them and their patients. The second task is trying to help supervisees offer interventions that promote joint reflection. And then finally is helping supervisees recognize and think about both internal and external barriers to offering high quality psychotherapy. Okay, so for the first task, reflecting on therapists' experience of the patient themselves and the therapeutic relationship. And I think that this is really just sort of setting the stage for a kind of reflective practice and away from some kind of concretized or step-by-step approach, where we're not just helping people identify symptoms, provide some direction about specific interventions to offer, but really to think about what's happening when they sit down in the room. And this, of course, is done in a sort of parallel way once they sit down in the supervision room. A key part of this, and this is really the supervision paper in the American Journal of Psychoanalysis, we focused almost entirely on this part, but supporting supervisees to be able to recognize the experience of fragmentation in patients. It doesn't seem like the majority of graduate training programs are spending a lot of time on this concept. So many supervisees come into the clinical setting with this, maybe having some kind of cursory understanding of fragmentation, maybe have read a little bit about it. But this isn't something where it is guaranteed that will come naturally to folks. And so trying to help people notice what this is like, how it emerges in the session, and then to think with them about what their reactions are to sitting in front of someone who is experiencing fragmentation. Really to also shift into focusing on what is happening between the two, in what ways does intersubjectivity seem to be forming, how is the alliance strong, what's missing, what are patients coming in and talking about, what seems to be left on the table. Some of this is really kind of shifting into thinking about countertransference or therapist reactions. And certainly if you're coming from a more psychodynamic perspective, this would not be unfamiliar. And I think much like with a lot of our work, this is really an integrative approach and not sort of the invention of brand new stuff. We're drawing from lots of different traditions, but trying to bring these things together in a way that seems to make sense. I think of kind of concretely in terms of trying to help people identify fragmentation. This does seem to need to go beyond just kind of teaching people about metacognition and helping them get reliable on scoring the Mass A. I can think of a time in supervision where a supervisee had shared a self-disclosure that she had made in session, and it was in response to a story that the client was sharing, and it seemed to map on quite well. But a major difference was because she was approaching the memory with much more intact metacognition, not in a state of fragmentation. The whole experience made much different sense to her, and it seemed like there's perhaps a gap and an opportunity in supervision to help really better kind of empathize with the experience of fragmentation beyond just knowing where to rate the patient on the on a self-reflectivity scale. As far as the supervisor's response, or what our kind of conduct should be as a supervisor, the hope here is not to just point out errors, but really to understand and to try to encourage additional reflection. With conceptualizations, the idea is to continually challenge people to think broadly, to explore meanings maybe that hadn't been considered before. And I think that part of the challenge here, at least for me as a supervisor, is to do this even if I tend to agree with the supervisee's take on things. It seems important that we both don't just settle on something prematurely, but to really try to keep things open and stimulate different ways of thinking about what's happening. Seems to pay dividends. Overall, I think this lines with the sort of broader call and merit to establish consultative relationships. We want to recreate that same kind of non-hierarchical stance with our supervisees as we ask merit therapists to do in session with patients. And again, drawing on older work, there's a favorite quote here from Harold Searles. The supervisor orientation, which I have found most effective and realistic, is predominantly lateral rather than a vertical or hierarchical orientation. I'm not literally a supervisor in the ordinary sense of the term who's endeavoring to control the student's treatment of the patient. I am rather a comparatively experienced colleague to one side to whom he turns for help with his work. I can be of maximal help to him to the extent that I can discover with him a larger and deeper understanding of what is going on between the patient and himself. So, forgiving Searles' apparent lack of ever supervising a woman, I think the quote is a really I find it kind of a moving and quite, has a lot of resonance with how I think about supervision and what we're trying to do here. The idea of being a comparatively experienced colleague that's sort of offering assistance and helping people think more deeply about things is quite appealing, and I think maps onto the work well. Okay, so shifting into the second task then, this really, it does seem distinct, but it builds quite directly upon the first task of encouraging this kinds of reflection, but to really try to help figure out how do we offer interventions that promote joint reflection, that encourage intersubjectivity and dialogue, again, but try to reduce some of the hierarchical relationships, and to really keep the focus on thinking with the patient about meanings and not just making specific decisions about what intervention to offer. Within this, it seems useful to consider less conventional strategies, playfulness, maybe provocative or challenging interventions, trying to help supervisees think about ways to use disclosure in a way that encourages dialogue rather than shuts things down or is done in a way that is really attending to their own emotional needs in session. And I think in thinking about trying to use some of these strategies, it seems to me really essential that we are both modeling and sharing our own experiences, things that we've tried, things that worked well, things that didn't work well, but also keeping in mind how to make it consistent with the particular therapist's personality and demeanor. I mean, I think about times when I was in supervision with Paul and he offered some story about some intervention that he offered, that if I would have tried to just do it the way he did, it would have bombed. And I think trying to find our own voice in ways to do this, I think is really important. Although I think the general approach of trying to be playful or to use interventions that challenge people to kind of disrupt someone sort of shutting down I think that the three kind of basic categories work across the board, but I do think that we need to figure out ways to make them map onto our individual personalities and the specific relationships that we have with people. Okay, so then the third task then is examining internal and external barriers to this kind of work. And when we're talking about internal and external barriers, I think sometimes the line blurs a little bit for a couple of these, but kind of roughly split apart. Some of the internal barriers might be supervisees' personal beliefs or worries about psychosis or about how they're conducting themselves as a therapist. There may be pressures or biases about really knowing patients. This might be especially when our patients are engaging in life pursuits that are not socially normative or not what we would choose for people. Embedded in all of this is the idea that recovery should be self-directed and that these interventions should help patients be kind of taking charge of their own experiences in recovery rather than us dictating what is best for them. And sometimes this can cause some tension and desire to avoid, I think. Another fear might be this idea that as you get to know someone or feel more connected to them, to think more deeply with them about their life, that an enormous amount of pain would emerge and be intolerable. And maybe it's more than the supervisee had really bargained for going into the work, you know. Certainly, things like imposter syndrome can contribute to anxiety and sort of reluctance to fully engage, kind of shut down or desire to latch on to some other kind of more directive or kind of standard approach to intervening. And some supervisees are just, you know, very well-behaved, rule-following types. And if their advisor in their program told them that you should never be silly in a session or should be very cautious about ever sharing anything from your personal life, there may be some kind of conflicting allegiances where you feel like you're breaking rules to be able to do some of these things. Now, external barriers, in my experience, the vast majority of supervisees that I've worked with are thoughtful and aware and notice these things right away, especially in settings like ours, where this work is not the kind of default attitude, and it doesn't come naturally when there are such a huge volume of patients, lots of pressures to achieve short-term behavior change. Our treatment plans are structured in a particular way that may or may not align with some of these ideas about the importance of shared meaning making in treatment. There are all these kinds of regulatory requirements and documentation requirements and an incredibly heightened emphasis on risk management and suicide prevention, and all of these things can kind of contribute to a culture that is different from what we're suggesting as essential here. In addition, there may be broader societal attitudes about what a therapist is supposed to be doing in the case of psychosis, and some of these things can contribute to causing supervisees to feel pulled into what we've called closed interpersonal stances. So in light of the kind of long list of different internal and external barriers, what do we think that the supervisor should be doing? It seems like it's useful to just have frank discussions about the reality of these systems challenges. I think we want to be careful to do this in a way that is continuing to support the supervisee's ongoing, reflective processes, the first two tasks specifically, rather than it just kind of devolving into complaining about how messed up the system is. But it does seem useful to sometimes talk directly about the challenges. Helping people just kind of raise awareness about their internal barriers is a little bit different approach. And I think in terms of the first task of just encouraging additional reflection, hopefully that is starting things going that way. I think with a lot of these supervisor self-disclosure, sharing experiences that that we've had, especially maybe earlier in our career or when we were training, can be a useful way to model the stance and normalize it. And I think for the most part, having these kinds of discussions, approaching it still in this kind of consultative way, can stimulate supervisees to develop confidence, to feel a little bit less concerned that these normal reactions that they're having are just a sign that they're actually a phony, or that they've somehow tricked their way along and are not prepared to go out into the world or whatever. And I think with all of this, really acknowledging and thinking together about how difficult this work can really be. All of these barriers contribute to complicating things, but this doesn't even speak to the just natural challenges of working with people that have incredibly serious, complicated problems, and trying to form these kinds of relationships when there are all kinds of different factors from the patient side that are potentially complicating interpersonal connection and shared meaning making. Okay, I thought it would be useful, and looking around the room, I hope this isn't too redundant, as I've talked about these things a lot over the years, but in just kind of thinking through these topics, I thought it might be useful to revisit some of these interpersonal stances, because it does seem still that supervisees kind of naturally get pulled into these different closed stances that inhibit intersubjectivity. And these four we've had laid out in that paper in 2016 are certainly apply to well-meaning supervisees. The arbiter of reality is a stance where, as a result of being privileged with good health and intellect, you have a clearer view of the client's circumstances, and then there's some pressure to kind of usher the client into seeing things the way we see them. The spokesperson is a supervisee who is deeply concerned about social justice, recognizes the marginalization of the client, and kind of adopts a stance of avowedly advocating for the client, fighting with the other people on the treatment team who are mistreating them or not recognizing these factors. Minister of comfort, someone who primarily operates from a place of wanting to eliminate as much distress as possible, to calm people down, to have clients leaving feeling more relaxed and comfortable than when they came in. And then the ambassador of health, someone who considers themselves to be a quite healthy person and would like to somehow impart this by advising clients on wellness promoting activities. And all four of these have in common a kind of stance that perhaps undermines the client's agency, positions the therapist as the one who knows best, and kind of recreates the kind of power dynamics and hierarchy that are easy to slip into. All of them, though, can also be recreated in supervision. As a supervisor may feel pulled into any of these kind of meta stances. Supervisee who's acting as the arbiter of reality quite easily, for me, prompts a desire to correct them and help them see that they are seeing things incorrectly. I think the spokesperson is certainly a common one to come in, and I think can be a little tricky, trying to not discourage supervisees from being worried about stigma and trauma and social marginalization, but how to take that and shift into this more of a joint meaning-making stance rather than trying to correct all of the wrongs in society. I think that as a supervisor, it's the similar kinds of tactics that go across all those other three tasks when supervisees are getting pulled into these closed stances. The things that seem to work best for me are things like disclosing my own experiences, trying to find ways to reconsider different ways of looking at whatever it is that we're talking about in supervision. I should have done something on supervision with through WebEx. And I think it's occurring to me as I'm talking through here, with sharing my screen and only seeing a couple of you very small in the corner, it's even harder for me to actually think these things through in a way, because I feel so much more removed from the person that I'm trying to think with. But in terms of some of the practical considerations, it does seem like you have to have some kind of foundational grasp of psychotherapy and some basics of marriage. There's not really any way around that. We can't just start off completely fresh. What we have done, both Eskenazi and collaboration with all of the VA over the last several years, when we bring new students in, at least, I've tried to offer some, front end training that's a bit more didactic, encourage people to read about merit. And so kind of come into the work with some of the kind of basics. It does seem useful to offer these different formats. I've always done group supervision, but it seems like especially the combination of individual supervision and group supervision creates rich opportunities for different kinds of development. For supervisees to be able to think with their peers or with a combination of supervisors about certain clients does seem to generate additional ideas, different kinds of conceptualizations, and also in terms of some of the barriers can be a nice way to support each other and to recognize that other people encounter the same kinds of barriers to the work. Whereas individual supervision, naturally, you get more focus on the particular person, can have perhaps deeper conversations that are more extended about particular patients. And then also book club seems to add an additional value to it. So the last couple of slides, I did want to talk a little bit about book club and how I think it ties in with some of these ideas. For those of you that haven't been involved in the Supervision Book Club, what we've tried to do over the last several, as long as we've been doing this, really is to have an ongoing opportunity to read selections of fiction and then to think together about the book, to try to link it to merit, to conceptualizing psychosis, to thinking about our role as therapists. And so really, I think, and these are a couple of papers that we've written in the past about this. At Eskenazi, we've been running book club continuously, I think since 2014. I can't remember exactly when Bethany got over to Park and we started doing this, but we meet every about 6 weeks, give or take a few. We've done a lot of different books. We have a few that are sort of the core canon that we've reread and seem to be especially valuable when we've got new students to try to make sure that they catch those. But it's really become a kind of an ongoing thing where we encourage other people to bring in different selections that they might work. There are a few common themes, but typically the books haven't necessarily been explicitly about mental illness or psychosis. Sometimes there are characters that have kind of manifest illness, or it's quite intentional. That's kind of the key theme. But the idea really is that this is a kind of different experiential way to learn and think. I think that it maps on really well to both the first task and encouraging reflection on patient themselves and relationships. And it works well with thinking about some of the internal and external barriers to it. I think it works a little bit less with the second task in terms of how do we identify particular interventions that are stimulating joint reflection. We just had our most recent book club last Friday, and as I was putting together some of these slides, I was thinking about this, and an example that really stood out was a member of the book club had shared a reaction to the book about confronting pain and the desire to maybe avoid or the kind of intolerability of being close to pain. And I think that was a reflection that would have been less likely to have come from just talking to them about their work with patients. It seemed like having the book as a bit removed was a way to kind of open up a space to consider what that might mean. And thinking about some of those internal barriers, I think that some of those things are not they're not socially desirable, or they're not the ways therapists are supposed to be thinking. Well, I'm a therapist, of course I'm able to tolerate emotional distress, and I of course want to feel connected to people, and I'm good at doing that. And so I think having the book generate some of those ideas is another avenue that can open up meaning making in a way that is, I think, more challenging to do directly from just talking about patients. In case anyone is interested, or for the records, Bethany especially, this will go down as the exhaustive collection here. I did type up all the books that we've ever read for book club, unless I've missed some. The ones in bold are the ones that we've reread. So yeah, if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share slides if you want to be a completist and order all these books on Amazon. Okay, so that was what I had prepared. And then I think the hope would be to shift over to Jackie, and then we can kind of go back and forth.
I think I have to unmute in order to do that. Yeah, I think, Jay, as you were talking and presenting these 3 different tasks, they had me reflecting a lot on my own experiences as a supervisee, learning merit, and also as a supervisor here at the Chillicothe VA. So I wanted to briefly provide some background as far as kind of the setup at this VA. I'm in rural Ohio, and I primarily supervise interns as a part of the internship program here. So we have 6-month rotations. So I have 3 days a week with the supervisee for 6 months, and they also have a minor rotation every 1 day a week for the whole year. So that's another supervisor, and then they shift to another major rotation. So sometimes I'm able to work with the trainee all year long if they want to keep 1 or 2 cases in addition to their new rotation. Sometimes I'm the second rotation for the last 6 months right before they graduate. So there is some kind of external barriers, which feels like it's just a very short amount of time. A lot of the folks that I work with don't have a background in merit training. So I think when I'm starting to meet with supervisees and they're learning merit at the same time, and they're participating in merit supervision, they're experiencing something very different. And a lot of times what comes to the surface is a desire for more structure. They want me to teach them skills, show me the ways to do it, show them the ways to do it, and tell them exactly what to say. And similar to wanting to promote autonomy with clients, I often strive to keep the stance to promote autonomy and allow the supervisee to come to their own process, which causes them great frustration and causes them to view me and our training in a very different way, different from other supervisors here at the VA and previous sites. And I remember thinking, every time this conversation emerges, I remember thinking about my own experience as a supervisee and begging, like, what do? I don't understand merit. I don't understand what fragmentation is, and psychosis is confusing. I'm disoriented, I'm uncertain, and just wanting all the certainty in the world to know what to do in these sessions. And the more I read, the more confused I got. And really kind of fighting the urge to appear competent in supervision rather than kind of pointing out my best moments, sharing like the hardest moments, for example, and thinking about what I needed was to kind of let go of being certain and helping students now to let go of that uncertainty. And kind of as I gave up some of the defenses that I had, which was to like over intellectualize, etc., that allowed clients, I was able to better relate to them and understand what it was like, and then use that information to relate to them. And so when I think about my own experiences, it's still like really hard when the student comes to me and says, give me more structure, I don't want this much autonomy, help me, direct me. And Jay, you kind of mentioned this in your presentation, like when the student wants you to direct the session, I just wonder, how do you frame that? This is probably like a quadruple parallel process now, but like, how do you frame it for someone who is new to merit or who is struggling in that way to sit with uncertainty? Do you have any more thoughts about that?
Yes, it's a good question. You bring up a bunch of really interesting things, Jackie. I am certainly in thinking about your experiences with students who maybe you've had less say on who is going to be working with you, and they may not have had experience with this kind of work, and so then it seems especially jarring to get in front of you and then be offered something different. I think here our students are a little bit more carefully vetted, and they're coming here to work specifically with this approach, and maybe are a little bit less inclined to come in and be asking for a bunch of structure. I guess, I think that in trying to think about what why that structure is important for the particular person, what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And usually here we do, I think, run into this more with some of the regular staff rather than our direct students, where we have therapists who do want that and they want to just be told. And I'm thinking about someone who I have less experience with, but who Jackie, I don't remember which one of you are evil Jackie or good Jackie, but the other Jackie tends to run into, who definitely he definitely wants this. He kind of comes in and wants Jackie to just tell him what to do. But then, of course, like actually isn't that interested in trying it out. It's different part of it, you know. But it seems like in some ways you sort of answer the question in my mind, which is like, well, what worked for you was to try to reduce some of the defensiveness and to be able to think about the parts that you were uncertain about or were fearful of. And I imagine in supervision, the only way to do that really, much like in therapy, is to form a relationship with the person that creates the space that that's even possible. I think that there have been times where I've had staff that want that kind of direction, but also I don't have the kind of relationship with them that would allow for that kind of vulnerability in supervision. And I think that takes some work to do it. So for me, it's easier if it's an ongoing supervision versus just kind of a one-off kind of consultation. Hey, Jay, can you tell me what to do in this session with this client that you don't know? You know, does that track? I feel like I got a little rambling.
No, I think having that relationship, and then I think a lot of times the student is could be frustrated with me as the supervisor not providing enough autonomy. And part of my task I see is to kind of tolerate that frustration and that challenge that they're now putting towards me and make sense of it together. And over time, allow them to explore why that's coming into our supervision session and how it might relate to their work with clients. I think I've had that happen in particular. I'm thinking of kind of to your next point. I guess, yeah, when you were talking, like parallel process came into my mind a lot throughout this presentation and these concepts. And I think especially when you're talking about the stances, the open stances, and that's an example of when like frustration comes at me as a supervisor where I could be pulled into a closed stance pretty fast. And knowing that I want to maintain this open stance, I have to kind of resist a lot of urges, which is like to speed up the student's process or the trainee's process. Another kind of time, as you were talking about the closed stances, that kind of struck me or that came to my mind about supervising was a time when I had a student who was very uncomfortable with a client's distress. Like the client was calling her out, requesting all these calls back, talking outside of session, coming into session really distressed and then no showing. And in the VA, we have to do these 3 phone calls, which creates weird external barriers and doesn't allow for maybe some risk accepting that might be helpful to maintain a frame. And I found myself kind of really challenging her not to return phone calls and putting my opinion out there, sharing this idea. And it seemed like she just became more and more discouraged and kind of frustrated with me and almost not accepting like getting mad about my idea. And then from there, my natural response was to encourage her and support her and comfort her and tell her how to trust the process. And sure enough, now I'm in this parallel process that has emerged that I wasn't aware of, and I'm the minister of comfort. And we had to, and then when that emerged, I had to bring it to the surface, and we talked about how I was kind of patronizing her now and what that was like for her. And it was very uncomfortable and vulnerable to get that feedback and be open to hearing about it. And also I was able to talk about times where I felt like I didn't want sympathy, you know, when I was mad or something. And then I think it's like I accidentally modeled it for her, how to kind of use this information about closed stance and then relate it back to the client. And I think it can be really tricky when like trainees get into these closed stances and they don't know it, especially, or they have stigma about clients and they don't know it, or it's deeply unconscious, or it's a part of their professional identity, like the advocate. And I find that stance most challenging. I don't know, Jay, if you have or not. I was curious more about how you approach that supervisory.
Well, yeah, I certainly think that is a challenge, and you know, it also pulls on our own, you know, my own kind of biases and way of thinking about the world or whatever. You know, like I got into this work partially driven by like pre-existing concerns about social justice and wanting to work in public sector, and you know, like there are parts of who I am that naturally make me susceptible to those kinds of things, but it does seem like it's a quite common stance for, you know, gung-ho graduate students or early career therapists to come in and want to just sort of wage war and right all the wrongs. And the idea that could possibly be driven by anything other than, you know, the correct way of approaching the world is hard for some people. The idea that it could actually be stigmatizing to further take away agency from people who have had so much harm done to them. I think that is a complicated thing or a subtle thing for many supervisees.
I think sometimes it calls for like the supervisee to give up parts of their professional identity that they might have formed in grad school, similar to calling for a client to give up a part of their identity at times when they start to reintegrate other parts.
Yeah, and I guess I think that as people are better able to recognize how agency can continue to exist in people who maybe have lost sight of it or have still faced, you know, lots and lots of injustice. I think helping people notice that also helps reduce some of the pressure. I'm thinking about this guy who, Adam, the guy that I supervise here, has been working with and presented in one of our clinical calls recently. But the guy had the whole clinic completely up in arms after he had lit a fire outside of the door of the clinic. And the police were furious about his law breaking, immediately arrested him, sent him to jail. And a lot of the staff were at their wits' end because this was a guy who was homeless and who said that he had lit the fire to stay warm. But helping them notice that it was like 45 degrees out and he had been all over the city and he just so happened to set the fire immediately in front of our front door, that this could possibly be evidence that this person has more agency than he's letting. Those kinds of reflections in supervision over time can really help people feel less pressure about like, I have to save the day and I have to go, you know, I have to be the person to do the advocacy or whatever. And then I think it opens up the possibility of that there might be some more value in thinking with that guy about why he decided to do that. You also said something that prompted a thought, and I don't think I said it much, but certainly like I feel all of these cultural pressures or like systems pressures. I'm not immune to the like risk management mania or whatever, you know, and I think it gets trickier than when you have a student too. I'm pretty comfortable at living with my own level of, risk tolerance or whatever. But trying to help a student do that while also recognizing that they're operating, under my, license and all of the liability or whatever that goes with that, that does add a complication. And it does make me feel at times compelled to like rush in and do the thing for the student. And trying to decide when that seems like a necessary approach to shield the student from some particular unpleasantness, or assume if somebody's going to get in trouble for this, it's going to be me. I think those things are still, that's a work in progress, trying to sort that out. But it's definitely a space where you can get kind of pulled into one of those stances as a supervisor.
Yeah, I think a lot of times I tend to rely on mutual reflection of the client's agenda, thinking together as trying to explore why they're doing what they're doing, or why psychosis might occur in the session when it does, and making sense and meaning out of that, and conceptualizing the client's agenda kind of helps promote this idea of agency in a way that's not as direct or challenging. It allows the student to really think about, or the supervisee to really think about and position the client as an agent who is making decisions in sessions and in their interpersonal lives. I think that can be particularly challenging when the person is experiencing a lot of psychosis in a session, however. And it's important and it's very challenging to help the supervisee understand that psychosis is symbolic and might be a means of communicating something to the therapist, or might be a way to cope with overwhelming affect, and to see it in that way. I think those are discussions that I'm often having with supervisees, especially who are new to merit. Do you find yourself talking a lot about?
Yeah, sure. I think it does strike me that I think most people, that by the time they get to graduate school, have some basic understanding that humans like traffic in metaphor and symbol. but then you get into the clinical stuff, it's like the clinical training somehow like it completely causes people to forget that. But I do think there's another reason why I think book club is so great, because this is another space to reinforce that this is a human endeavor. Humans do deal in metaphor and symbol, and there are ways to kind of think about the meanings of these things versus just being completely burdened by clinical jargon and kind of reducing things down to a sign or symptom of illness. And for me, I think the hope is you get supervisees that come in with kind of a natural openness or have some whatever, either their personality style or their interests or something, or people that are into the arts or humanities or something that are kind of naturally inclined to remember that when they're dealing with clients. If someone comes in very rigid and unwilling to see that that people don't always say what they mean, that increases the difficulty level, I think, quite a bit.
I think sometimes this kind of relates to the internal barriers that you were speaking about. I'm thinking about when I was working with a trainee or a supervisee in particular. She was meeting a client who preferred only to talk about like the universe and his theories on it, and she kept getting very frustrated, having trouble kind of inserting her own mind into the session, feeling like the client wasn't giving her any space. And the more we kind of explored that frustration and again tried to explore the agenda of why he's talking about the universes and the theories, I think what we came to was that she might have been afraid to get to know him and elicit narrative episodes for fear that all this pain would emerge, and that she might see him as someone who made horrible decisions in the past and was mean to people and had horrible trauma history, and that she might have to sit in that pain with him.
Sure.
And, I think oftentimes when that stage of recovery occurs, the supervisee looks to me like, what do I do now? Like, is the client going to be able to withstand the pain? Will I make him worse? Will he have to go to the hospital again if I keep talking about these things or getting to know him? So I think even with well-intentioned supervisees, there's lots of fears. I mean, I still have all those fears lots of times working with folks.
Sure. Yeah, and I think I do think that there's a role where it's not some kind of meta position of the minister of comfort where you're just trying to take away the supervisee's distress, but naturally having a space to empathize and support supervisees as they deal with really heavy stuff. It seems like, of course, that's a thing that happens in supervision. I think in this room here, I can think of many conversations with Kelsey toward the end of her training with a guy who the therapy became increasingly characterized by just profound loneliness and heartbreak. Or some of the conversations that Allison has been having with some of her clients recently who, again, are just, profoundly affected by heartbreak and isolation. And hopefully the supervision creates some space that we can think about that together. And it's not just me trying to make Allison or Kelsey feel better by the end of supervision, but that together we can kind of reflect on those things, come up with different ideas about how to best bear witness to and respond to those experiences. It seems like a valuable space that you have to really carve out. I mean, I think that this is a like-minded group and where we all tend to agree, but on the value of this. But I don't think that it's the default mode. And I think trying to really be intentional in our systems about creating space for this kind of sort of culture of reflection seems to be really essential and not always so easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like setting up the frame when we are reflecting and trying to create the space for reflection has been helpful within all the barriers that I experience here at this BA, such as it's hard to do the work and then, jump to, sometimes trainees are using a different mode of therapy right after our supervision hour, and so like trying to frame it in a way that allows them space to think more about it, letting them pick the supervision time, maybe at the end of the day. I also find myself using lots of self-disclosure during those like painful moments when the person is sitting in pain and just sharing that I've cried thinking about clients' pain and helping them make sense of it. I was curious, so I know we have like 30 minutes left of the meeting. I didn't know if this would be a good time to open up discussion for the rest of the folks on the call. Jay, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I'd be very interested to hear what people's thoughts were and what your experiences are supervising or being supervised.
I was wondering, like, maybe people have experienced barriers that we haven't discussed or had other areas that have been challenging that we haven't touched on.
Something that I was thinking about was how, like, when you identify that a supervisee might have low self-reflectivity themselves, and thus like how that connects to their mastery, and maybe you do pick up on snippets of that in their personal lives, but I've largely seen it play out in, just navigating, orienting to this clinic, or just cases in general, like their own problem solving abilities. So I was thinking a lot about that, and how that can be a challenge, but how also maybe aspects of this might help them, and it might be possible to kind of overcome that. And I think with my more recent trainee, I've seen that happen and somehow been able to turn a corner, I think.
What do you think has helped?
I think just staying the course, just being consistent. I think that's been one thing. Also, I think me actually having awareness of what was going on, where the problems might be coming from, and kind of meeting them where they were at, like, and kind of like doing scaffolding like I might in therapy. I think that's been another key ingredient.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that the meeting where you're at, that if somebody is really sort of struggling, not just with agreeing with kind of the basic assumptions of merit, but having some difficulty in reflecting on their own lives in a way that is going to impede their work, then trying to simplify things and support some of the more basic forms of reflection. Hopefully they're not so impaired that they can't, but it does seem like tailoring things down, much like we would as a therapist, is essential. I've had more experience.
And I think along with that, it's also involved not talking about myself too much. So kind of like, or overly inserting myself, or recognizing that using this is what I would do kind of intervention isn't going to land.
I wonder if there is a sense in which, this speaks to the issue of structure as well as the issue of being an imposter and not telling people what to do. But I feel like there is a way in which, in our supervision here, we've come to say, well, here's what you should do. You should be yourself. And I can't tell you who you are. But whatever that is, that's you need to be relating to the person. And you can only relate to that person as a unique being, or there is no real relation. I'm remembering a conversation Kelly and I had with a student from IU Bloomington. This is like 15 years ago. But he's like, so many of us are terrified of being imposters. What should we do? And our response was like, don't be an imposter. Because it's possible to do that, and that's not the bad way to go. But again, if you think about what it means to not be an imposter, you have to be yourself. And I think that speaks to a lot of what Jackie, you and Jay were talking about, that you yourself are complex beings and there are multiple aspects of you. And some supervisees are terrified to reveal their parts of them that are aggressive or confused, or, share some of the same rage and drives that the patient does. But it seems like there is this job to help people be themselves and to be comfortable being themselves without telling them who they are.
Paul, I was thinking about, and some of you experienced this, as interns, we would often play tapes of ours. And it seemed like those were really beneficial sessions that we had. It was with the interns. So there was probably 4 of us typically there, sometimes 5. And it was, I think that people would leave feeling really positive about that. And I would often think about, you and I were often vulnerable because these weren't perfect tapes, you know, in terms of what we did. And many of the interns would say, hey, I think this was going on, maybe you missed this. And it seemed to be a really helpful collegial example of how we get together and we think together. And there wasn't a perfect way to do it, but always opportunity to think of a better way to think about what was going on. And I suppose too, it took the heat off the interns to put the heat on us in thinking about our work as well. But it seemed like that was always a helpful intervention or supervision, it seemed, for a lot of our interns.
And I think like being as a supervisor, being yourself in the supervision process helps to kind of model this concept of be yourself and relate to the client as you.
Of course, Paul never role modeled that, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about how one of the most enjoyable aspects, I think, of being a supervisor in this system is that I can expose trainees to that different way of thinking or a way of doing something that maybe isn't exactly in line with the rules, or where can we half break the rules, and how that has also helped me to I guess like reflect on myself and reflect on what I'm doing and how I'm interacting with patients too.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the idea of play and challenge that Jay brought up, and how you can be yourself in those moments, and that those are kind of, you know, where the client is in the therapy dyad is often disrupted. The client doesn't see the therapist as the authority figure in those moments often. And I think it allows sharing those moments with the supervisee, gives them permission maybe to be more of themselves and be playful and challenge the client. I remember I was telling a supervisee something ridiculous I did, and she said, I don't want to say that to a client, you know, can I do that? So, you know, showing the person how you've taken risk and given them permission to take risks even under your license, I think has helped.
Jackie, that comment, it's making me think of something that a thought that's been kind of coming up like throughout this whole conversation. It's just, I can't remember if it was when we were doing like a merit orientation for all the new students with Paul, or if this was when Jay and I were teaching a class on merit. But I remember one of the students kind of sharing this reflection that it feels like you guys are telling us we're allowed to break the rules. And it was like a relief to her. Like she liked this idea that you could just like call a spade and like call it out when someone was doing something that, you know, felt like it was insincere, or you could kind of figured out what their agenda was and being able to name it and to think about it. And I think it's interesting because like that produced relief, I think, for that student, but certainly we've had others it's not relief. It doesn't bring relief. It makes them more anxious because, again, it doesn't fit maybe their idea of what they're there to do. But that kept going through my mind as we were thinking about like these different stances and how, yeah, that we are like sort of encouraging people to interact in a way that is genuine, that isn't just like, I'm the therapist, I have to be this particular thing, but that you're a human being in a room relating to people. And sometimes that's really hard for people to do. And I think that also comes into the supervisor-supervisee relationship, where people just have different levels of openness of like, again, like what they've come to do when they've come to their job, or they've come to a training experience. and I think that for me as a supervisor, like that influences my experience a lot. When someone comes in and I feel like they're there to like, I don't know, maybe they want to tell me that they admire me, or they want to like have me tell them what to do, and they have like an agenda like that, where it's not an agenda to just kind of come and learn. It does make it a lot more challenging, because I have to like name that they're trying to flatter me, or that they're there to like get their gold star for the day, but they don't really want to think. So yeah, I was just thinking about all these different, I guess, like layers to that.
Yeah, a piece of feedback I feel like I've given a fair amount in supervision is just, the trainee will say something, often maybe out of frustration or, whatever. And I'll just say, did you say that to the client? Or would you say that to the client? It's often met with like, what do you mean? I think that same attitude of like, of course I wouldn't say that. That's, breaking the rules or something. And so, just maybe I've seen it as just like a constant, stepwise process of continuing to make those suggestions and continuing to model that, that's what we're doing here, to maybe break down some of the defenses, for lack of a better word, that folks have about doing that sort of thing in session. Also, Bethany, I think I was that person, or at least I said that in one of the training, like my first parent training, and other people I'm sure have said it, but I remember saying that because I had the same initial revelation or reaction to all of it.
I remember you saying that for sure.
I thought you were always just the enforcer of the rules, Emily. This is shocking.
Well, until I got to you changed the course, broke me. I don't know, something.
Freed you.
As we're talking about some of this now, it's also led me to think about a recent discussion we had in our training committee meeting about next year's like selection process, and some ideas I proposed regarding changing our application, specifically the multicultural question that we have, because I've been noticing a lot of the responses don't actually help me to know anything about the applicant. And just kind of the idea was entertained for sure. There are plans for future discussion, but there was also a solid amount of resistance. And so I've just been thinking about, how do we truly get to know our trainees before they're even in front of us? Differences in how I might think about things versus other supervisors. And then also, is there a way to sort of take some concepts of, like the Mass A or something, and like read through an application in that way, or just how there might be some overlap?
Yeah, I think about our internship interview process, and I have scripted questions that I have to ask. And so it starts off much how I don't want it to. And basically I say, I have to ask these questions and I really don't want to. I'd rather just get to know you. But it is a barrier that is kind of that I face, that we're kind of confronted with right away, as far as establishing a rapport. And my stance is open, and someone who's a consultant and a colleague.
And then it's like, if you don't ask the questions, the interviewee is entirely thrown off, and that disrupts everything too.
And I've broken all the rules. And all the psychologists are gonna know. I think part of being at this VA in particular, kind of speaking to that, is being okay with being on an island and being the weird psychologist that no one really understands what I'm doing. and accepting that, and kind of going back to Paul's point, just being me, and and letting other people being curious about it if they want to be.
You have to aspire to being an archipelago. I think, joke aside, I felt much more on an island when I was first here. And then it's, I think one of the really rewarding things coming from supervision is developing other connections and allies, and having colleagues that participate in this together, instead of just feeling like, got to do it on your own.
Mm-hmm. Inviting people to the island.
I think that is a really key aspect of the work too. And like I know you guys talked about different forms of supervision, but one of the things that I find to be so beneficial in the group supervision is if there is an atmosphere of people coming in to think together. And so I'm always like thoughtful when I'm creating the schedule when like new students are starting, of like who I'm going to have give presentations, to model this idea that like you're coming in and like we're all going to think together about this patient. Like there isn't, someone's not going to come in and like show how good they're doing at merit, but come in and like think together about how do you understand this? Like what are some other ideas that could be going on? Because some people do approach group supervision like it feels like performance, like they have to have the smartest answers, or certainly when I was a student doing book club, it certainly felt like there were folks that approached book club in that way too, of like I gotta have the smartest comment in the room or have solved the book in some way, rather than coming in and like presenting their actual interaction with it and what their thoughts were. But I think it's been really hard, I think, in some ways to create that kind of environment, but certainly having people who are interested in the work and can kind of get behind that idea, it sets the atmosphere in a way that makes it just function a lot better. And group supervision becomes like one of my favorite hours of the day, that people are kind of coming together and like actually thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's again, I think it's a deeply parallel sort of process where we're thinking together about what we're even doing, and and we invite people to be curious about it. And I guess in that sense, we also wonder what they're up to. And this speaks to what so many of you were saying, which is how do we have a sense of the people coming here? And I feel like for me, that's not like what's their favorite color or do they like pizza, but it's like what's the project? What are they up to? What's their purpose? And I mean, as we talk about things that go well, it seems like it goes well if it's to know and understand. And it doesn't go well if it's to join an in-group that's going to be the new rule setters. And then that seems disastrous. And those people, they just want, I think psychology is full of people like this. They just sort of want to tell everyone else what to do. And that certainly is the opposite of what we're about. But that can masquerade as something so similar to what we're up to that it becomes tricky and, oftentimes I think difficult to extricate ourselves from.
Yeah, I think, again, another parallel here, if we think about this idea of like co-recovery, the ways that therapists grow and change as part of the work. I think it's definitely can happen in supervision too. I mean, I hope that my experience as a supervisor is not just me imparting knowledge to someone else, but I can think of all kinds of rewards in my own work and my own life, just from things that I've learned from thinking with supervisees over the years. And so I think that seems to map on both to therapy and to supervision, that this is kind of, a joint endeavor. So hopefully I'm not the same at the end of supervising someone for 2 years,
I've reflected a lot on what effective supervision truly entails or looks like. And I think it really is about creating a personal, thoughtful experience. And there are many ways to maybe get there. But I don't really think a lot about whether a supervisee likes me or not. I just know that that's kind of my anchor point, being effective, and whatever the end result is, as long as there's something in that realm, that's what's important to me.
I think too, I always used to like to create a safe space where people could just come in and think and be comfortable. I think I did that a lot with patients as well. So it worked well, I think, with interns and students, where they could come in and just safely explore their thoughts and be who they were. I think that's important to create as well, but also challenge, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember a lot of students would, there was a little bit of concern around Paul, at least in the beginning, whereas perhaps less with me, that people would come in and cry or be anxious. And it was really important to provide that space for them to have that opportunity to grow and be supported and help to reflect on what it was they were going through.
You know, that sounds almost quasi-therapeutic, doesn't it? And my thoughts I'm having, as I've been reading a great deal in a career retrospective kind of way of ego psychology and the object relations, British school in particular, and the importance of countertransference for the therapist, and particularly with Jay and Paul, kind of triggered in my mind was something we might call secondary countertransference. And you too, Kelly, the idea that as a supervisor, you're there, and in some ways, in an analog to being a therapist, to your supervisee, and the patient is also there by proxy, being the object of the discussion. So we have a very complicated milieu of at least 3 people we know in this triadic discussion, ostensibly about the goals of 2 of the folks, but the supervisor goals and personality and countertransferential reactions to both supervisee and to patient by proxy are just as important when we're talking about supervision. And I think you guys have done a good job of laying out the concerns of that kind of, professional yet mediated by your own personality status of the supervisor. I would just like to highlight this idea of secondary countertransference. And we all feel burned out. We all want to avoid a supervisory session. We all think certain supervisees are unprepared or in some ways inadequate, or in other cases, superstars and our favorites. I think it's incumbent to look deeply upon our own reactions as a supervisor. I'm speaking to somebody who's been out of the game for a long time and I'm rusty, but the supervisors that I had and on my own supervisory experience, on both sides of that, I found that very helpful and enriching to the whole purpose of the triadic dialogue. And I guess that would include a group situation too that somebody mentioned of supervision. It's fraught with the sort of dynamics that are going on in the consulting room itself, and it's not removed from that. So we have to, I think, pay close attention to what we're bringing and how we're altering that, the therapeutic dyad through our supervisory involvement.
Well, it did trigger a thought about times where maybe it's a supervisee that you really enjoy meeting with and is doing good work, and then how do you continue to not just settle into, well, this is easy, but help continue to challenge the person to keep going. And certainly that can happen, I think, in therapy too, as you described. But it's probably the examples that come to mind with some of these reactions are easier if it's like, oh, I've had some kind of negative response to the supervisee, but it does seem just as important to consider our role if we're meeting with a sort of a favorite, so to speak.
Yeah, I think a lot about how can I further their development or provide, how can we enhance this so the nuts and bolts are there, but am I going to be doing a disservice to them by just kind of giving a figurative pat on the head and moving them along? Or can we use the fact that there is a high level to increase the thoughtfulness and to have some more intense or maybe even conflictual discussions?
Makes me think of, there's a paper by Beyond, one of the British school people who Dave mentioned, who says that to have successful analysis, you have to forget your patient after every session. And I wonder if there's a sort of a parallel here also in supervision, which is to sort of forget whatever's gone on in the past and just deal what's emergent in the moment and be as challenging as possible. If I think about the person who was the most profound supervisor for me, oh my God, that guy never let up. And if you want to really master this was a good thing, but it was certainly, I was waiting for him to give up and give me that pat on the head, Jackie. That's what I wanted. Never came though.
It never came, and we might argue that the fact that it didn't is why you're talking about him. It left a supra-therapeutic impression on you in your training that immediately came to mind as an example there, Paul. So, there are needs for the supervisees bringing clinical material in that's their own, as well as representations of the patient dyadic experience, and the supervisor also is bringing those countertransferential issues, the need to be thought of as competent, perhaps, or as tolerating rule breaking, as some of you have mentioned. These things aren't incidental to the therapy that you're talking about. They drip through necessarily. So I would just like to continue to, encourage you to think about that whole set of relationships and the bidirectionality of influence. The patient's not even there, but they're an invisible presence. Meanwhile, in the therapy a week from now, you're not there, but you're an invisible presence. And those things are ultimately tangible and play out in the progress or lack of progress, particularly with severely disturbed patients.
Oh, fantastic comments, and completely agree. And yeah, and had I gotten the pat on the head, it would have totally ruined the mood. So no, it was good.
Well, I think, Paul, I asked you for a pat on the head, and you said I was too tall.
Probably. Well, it looks like we're at that time. I don't know if there are final comments to be made. This has been another really rich discussion. I'm so happy all of you joined us. This is, boy, just what I think I hoped of when Dave and Reed even first pushed the idea of we need a website. So this is really great to see happening.